Thank you very much, Alison. It's nice to be here and actually to see so many friends, some of whom I haven't seen for quite a while. I thought I couldn't be with you yesterday, but I understand that you had some very useful sessions. And I do think this conference is a timely and a welcome opportunity to reflect on how we have reached the stage where Britain has now formally applied under Article 50 of the Treaty of the European Union to leave the Union. And an opportunity to consider what are the consequences, what the challenges might be for Scotland and for Britain and for Europe, and specifically in this gathering, the churches in Europe. Churches in Europe which have historically articulated basic common values of our European home, values such as justice, of freedom, of tolerance, of solidarity, community, peace, respect for the dignity of each individual. And while I'll certainly try to be frank about some of the reasons why I think Britain voted as it did, I'm not a neutral commentator. As we heard in the opening reflections, there are more than one way of looking at things. In fact, I've pretty strong views on this issue, so it's important that you should understand where I'm coming from, as it undoubtedly colours my approach and analysis. As you've heard from Alison, I'm a Liberal Democrat. As a student, I voted for Britain's membership of the European Economic Community in 1975, and I've always been a staunch advocate for Britain's continuing membership. Without experiencing any crisis of identity, I can feel European, I can feel British, I can feel Scots, and by adoption, I can feel Orcadian. And in saying that, I think you probably also recognise that in the context of Scotland's constitutional debate, I support Scotland's continuing place in the United Kingdom. During the 2016 referendum, I was a board member of Britain Stronger in Europe, which was the designated lead organisation for the Remain campaign. And as a Liberal Democrat, whilst we recognise and respect the outcome of the vote on 23rd of June last year, I believe that when the terms of the exit agreement have been reached, the British people should be invited to vote on whether they wish to leave on these terms or remain as a member of the European Union. As the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, David Davis, said in 2012, if a democracy cannot change its mind, it ceases to be a democracy. So just let me start by reflecting on the campaign. I've got to admit that in a representative democracy, I find the idea of a referendum a bit of an anomaly. But Harold Wilson, our then Prime Minister, let the genie out of the bottle in 1975, and it's never been possible to put it back. And I think it's fair to say that most of the referendums we've had in this country have their origins in a political party trying to advance its cause or cover up its cracks. And this one was no exception, as David Cameron sought to bridge the chasm in the Conservative Party over our EU membership. And the problem is that a binary question can rarely do justice to what are inevitably complex issues. So in this case, it was easier possibly to be against the status quo because people knew what that was, or at least how it had been portrayed through the eyes of a Eurosceptic media. It was far more difficult to get a handle on what a vote to leave would lead to, and arguably it still is. Advocates of the Leave campaign presented probably as many varieties of Britain's future relationship with Europe as Heinz manufactured products. And this, of course, has consequences now, because the United Kingdom government can interpret the outcome in any way it likes, and seems intent in doing so in a manner which some on the Leave side specifically disavowed during the campaign. I found the campaign uninspiring and for the most part negative. The notorious bus promising £350 million per week for the National Health Service if only we vote Leave was a blatant deceit. And yet the broadcast media continued to interview leading Leave campaigners using the bus as a backdrop. And let's not kid ourselves, it was effective. Dominic Cummings, the campaign director for Vote Leave, wrote in an article earlier this year, would we have won without the £350 million for the NHS campaign? All our research and the close results strongly suggests no. And we were also threatened with tens of thousands of Turks pouring across Europe towards Britain, even although Turkey's membership of the European Union was on a back burner with the gas turned down so low it was almost off. But nor was the Remain campaign a source of inspiration. It certainly wasn't a rallying call for the values which the Conference of European Churches espoused in the Charta Oecumenica. I was, myself, prepared to endorse some of the so-called Project Fear campaign because I was scared, and still am scared, of some of the consequences of leaving. But the very alarmist Brexit budget, which the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, unveiled a short time before polling day, stretched credibility too far, and I strongly suspect was counterproductive. And there were many of us who would have liked to have emphasised the positive and the values which underpin the European Union. But the truth is that we live in an age of sophisticated pollsters. And those of us who were arguing that we should have more emphasis on values were told that people to whom these arguments would appeal were already strongly committed to voting Remain, and so wouldn't increase the Remain vote. The battle was to win over the people in the middle ground, whose hearts were probably sceptical, but whose heads, or perhaps more accurately their wallets, were susceptible to the economic case for remaining, or at least not for leaving. I recall being present at one Stronger In board meeting, where a colleague suggested that we should make the case that the European Union had secured our peace for 60 years after 2 world wars had ripped Europe asunder. But we were told by the polling experts that such an argument didn't have much traction, as no one thought war among the countries of the European Union was remotely credible. I did make the remark that that surely was the point. Referendums, and especially ones which are close run, are also divisive within families, within the workplace, around dinner tables in sports clubs, and can long continue to be so, and I don't believe that is healthy for our civic life. So what were some of the underlying reasons for the Brexit vote? In hindsight, maybe the result wasn't so surprising against a background of negative reporting for decades, myths about straight bananas and the like, and the default of many politicians, including those who are supportive of our membership, to blame Brussels whenever there was a problem or a difficulty. Just a small example. Remember when the Treaty of Lisbon was agreed, our then Prime Minister Gordon Brown didn't want to be seen signing the treaty with other European leaders. So he flew out the following day and signed it in splendid isolation. Now, what kind of image does that give back home? Scepticism has been well nourished over many years. The bold headline outcome was 51.9% leave, 48.1% remain. But the overall result doesn't show up significant regional variations. In Scotland, all 32 local authority counting areas returned a Remain majority, 62% in Scotland voting to remain overall. Wales, on the other hand, voted 52.5% to leave. Northern Ireland, 55.8% to remain, and England, 53.4% to leave. But even then, within these there's breakdowns, there's many differences. Stoke-on-Trent, 69.4% to leave, the London Borough of Lambeth, 78.6% to remain. And even within Scotland, there's been a more detailed breakdown of local ward counts, and that showed a cluster of 6 wards in the Banff-and-Buchan area in North Aberdeenshire had a strong Leave majority of 61%, quite possibly a reflection of long-standing discontent with the common fisheries policy. And it is a detailed breakdown and analysis which perhaps sheds some light on possible reasons for the Brexit vote. A report commissioned towards the end of last year by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation gives us some insight into the profile of Leave voters. I'll just give you some of their key findings. The poorest households with incomes of less than £20,000 per year were much more likely to support leaving the European Union than the wealthiest households were unemployed people in low-skilled and manual occupation, and people who feel that their financial situation is worsened, and people with no qualifications. Groups vulnerable to poverty were more likely to support Brexit. Age, income and education matter, though it is educational inequality that was the strongest driver. All other things being equal, support for Leave was 30 percentage points higher among those with GCSE qualifications or below than it was for people with a degree. Support for Brexit varied not only between individuals but also between areas. People with all levels of qualifications were more likely to vote Leave in a low-skilled area compared with a high-skilled area. Groups in Britain who have been left behind by rapid economic change and feel cut adrift from the mainstream consensus were the most likely to support Brexit. And as the report says, these voters faced a double whammy. While their lack of qualifications put them at a significant disadvantage in the modern economy, they were also being further marginalised in society by the lack of opportunities in their low-skilled communities. And this will make it extremely difficult, the report said, for the left behind to adapt and prosper in the future. So I strongly suspect that those who feel marginalised also felt that the system had let them down. And in many respects, the Leave vote was as much a protest against London as against Brussels. Studies show that the referendum attracted a group of new voters who did not participate in the previous 2015 general election. And a majority of them, 60% of that group, voted to leave. Were they the people disillusioned by the political system, who no longer felt sufficiently connected to elect a government, but took the opportunity of a referendum to register their discontent? And moreover, many of these people may well feel that the so-called metropolitan elite despise or look down on them, screaming headlines about scroungers which appear to demonise unskilled and unemployed people rather than seeking to address their problems. And perception also plays a part. Perceptions matter in democratic politics, even when they're wrong or they're myths. And immigration was a key issue in the campaign, but many areas which voted strongly for Brexit had far fewer immigrants than elsewhere. But yet there was a fear of immigration, a fear that it put pressure on our National Health Service, notwithstanding the fact that immigrants provide vital services within our National Health Service. And if people are experiencing longer waiting times or can't get a doctor's appointment, the problem is far more likely to be one of funding pressures on the NHS than an influx of immigrants. So one of my colleagues put it, the NHS is underfunded and struggles to cope with elderly British far more than with young and fit migrants. And many of the myths given the oxygen of credibility by a campaigning Brexit press undoubtedly swayed a number of voters. So going forward, I think there is a challenge to both politicians and to churches to engage with the so-called left-behind communities. I was interested, those of you who perhaps heard it at 5:45 this morning, Bob Fyffe talking about on Prayer for the Day, talking to the mission to the margins. I think today being the birth of Day of St. Francis Xavier, who articulated that. And we are talking about missions to the margins, possibly not just in Britain, but in other parts of Europe as well. So going forward, the Joseph Rowntree report concluded, the result of the referendum therefore has shown new light on deeper social, geographic and cultural divides that often lay hidden below the surface of our national conversation. Looking ahead, it seems likely that these stubbornly persistent and growing inequalities will strengthen. Now this isn't a time or place for a detailed manifesto, but rather a time to recognise a challenge. How do we re-engage with dispossessed communities within our national community? Key ingredients, I believe, will surely include investment in education, from preschool through to further education, a renewed commitment to lifelong learning, tackling a long-standing shortage of vocational skills, regeneration of local employment, addressing discontent over inadequate housing provision, tackling the belief that social housing has been allocated to immigrants and incomers rather than to local people. And it's a huge challenge, but there are three things that particularly cause me concern as we seek to address this challenge. Firstly, many of those who led the Brexit campaign don't seem to be the natural allies of the dispossessed and the poor. The economic agenda of many prominent in the Leave campaign, of Britain becoming a low-tax, smaller state, unfettered free trade nation, would without doubt leave dispossessed communities even poorer. Indeed, even without such an agenda, the harsher realities of Brexit could well be visited more on those communities. Researchers at the think tank Demos studied regional differences in the reliance on exports to the European Union, the use of European workers, and the receipt of European Union support grants. It found that Wales, the northeast of England, and the East Midlands all showed relatively heavy dependence despite being home to a preponderance of Leave voters. There wasn't a universal correlation. Northern Ireland, which as I've said voted to remain, would also be particularly vulnerable to risks. And South West England, which voted to leave in strength, would be far less affected. But in the longer term, even if the worst projections for our economy don't come to pass, most commentators predict a longer period of austerity, and that scarcely bodes well for those who are most dependent on our public services. And that leads me to my second concern. If reality is harsh, or if it falls well short of the promised sunlit uplands, will this not lead to an even greater disillusionment with the political process and with politicians? When we no longer have Brussels to blame, what then? And if we're going to head off the scope for increased populism from the left or from the right, surely that makes tackling the issue of voter engagement and the agenda to tackle individual and community deprivation even more crucial. And my third concern is that with that kind of challenge, are our political classes going to be able to raise our heads from the morass of Brexit processes and the legislation to address the challenges which I've described? Frankly, I'm not optimistic. Our Parliament has already passed the European Union Notification of Withdrawal Act. The Government has signified its intention to bring in a bill with the grand but somewhat misleading title of the Great Repeal Bill, which will reenact in our domestic law the vast tracts of law which have either come directly from the European Union or have been enacted under the European Communities Act of 1972, which will be repealed. And of course, this is essential to avoid a legal vacuum on the day after we leave. But it's an immense task. It's pregnant with possibility for Lords and Commons to amend, and with obvious potential to trigger legislative consent motions in the Scottish and Welsh Parliaments, and hopefully will be in being, the Northern Ireland Assembly. None of these legislative consent motions are foregone conclusions, and that has all the ingredients for a political standoff. In addition to that, the respected Institute for Government has estimated that up to 15 new bills, in addition to the Great Repeal Bill, could be required to deliver Brexit. Its report legislating Brexit warns that Brexit will place a huge burden on both Parliament and Government. On average, each Queen's speech at the start of a parliamentary session announces only about 20 bills. So 15 new Brexit bills before Britain even exits will leave very little space for non-Brexit legislation and addressing some of the challenges which I believe exist. There are further complications regarding the position of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Although a common travel area has existed since the Irish Republic was established, it's never been tested in circumstances where one country was in the European Union and the other was not. Almost everyone agrees that continuing to progress the peace process requires a soft border, but what that actually will entail is not quite so clear. And it's in the interests of the whole of these islands that proper attention and satisfactory attention is given to that. Here in Scotland, we have the added distraction of a Scottish Government seeking a further referendum on Scottish independence, less than 3 years after we took a once-in-a-generation opportunity to vote on our continuing membership with the United Kingdom. I'll not rehearse all my profound objections to independence, but suffice to say that when our National Health Service waiting targets are being missed, when pupil attainment in Scotland's schools are dropping down international comparison tables, when a centralised police service fails to inspire local confidence in many areas, the Scottish Government seems reluctant to use social security powers now available to it. I don't believe a further referendum would be my top priority. If all this sounds downbeat, it's because I do entertain these serious concerns. But if there's concerns, there's also challenges. Not just to those of us who have pursued the political road to service, but also to our churches. Let me repeat once again the conclusion of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation report. The result of the referendum, therefore, has thrown new light on deeper social, geographic and cultural divides often hidden below the surface of our national conversation. Looking ahead, it seems likely these stubbornly persistent and growing inequalities will strengthen. In other words, these problems were there already. It wasn't the referendum that caused them. And we're talking about people, we're talking about communities. Communities where there is long-term joblessness. And that in turn can lead to poor health, to mental depression, overlapping with low skills and motivation, low aspirations for children, poor parenting, thus transferring deprivation from one generation to the next. In the concluding chapter of a book on Rock or Sand, Firm Foundations for Britain's Future, a book of contributed essays on public policy issues published just before the last general election, the Archbishop of York, John Sentamu, quotes from William Temple's book, Christianity and Social Order. The primary principle of Christian ethics and Christian politics must be respect for every person, simply as a person. If each man and woman is a child of God whom God loves and for whom Christ died, then there is each a worth absolutely independent of all usefulness to society. The person is primary, not the society. The state exists for the citizen, not the citizen for the state. And I think that reflection from Archbishop William Temple finds an echo in the Keck letter on the future of Europe. A timely reminder that all our debates on structures and on terms of exit are not for the benefit of institutions, but must seek to be for the benefit of the citizen, and the citizen of whatever state. And in that book I've referred to, Archbishop Sentamu also quotes from Wilkinson and Pickett's book, The Spirit Level. I quote again, "For several decades, progressive politics have been seriously weakened by the loss of any concept of a better society. People have argued for piecemeal improvements in different areas of life. They've campaigned against new environmental threats, or for better treatment of asylum seekers, or have demonstrated against military interventions. But nowhere is there a popular movement capable of inspiring people with a vision of how to make society a substantially better place for the vast majority. Without that vision, politics will rarely provoke more than a yawn. Or as the book of Proverbs reminds us, where there is no vision, the people perish. The challenge for churches in Britain and in Europe is to be the prophetic voice articulating that vision. And with respect, there's no shortage of material in the Gospels.
Thank you very much, Jim. And we now have Bob Fyffe, who's going to give us a brief commentary on that. Thank you very much,
Bob. I'm sure we would all want to thank Lord Wallace, Jim Wallace, for sharing something of the inside story of the referendum and a lot of the politics around that. And I think that what he's done is he's drawn us to the heart of so much that we have been discussing in our different contexts, and certainly discussing yesterday, not least the task of defining the Church's work on a Brexit for the common good. And so much of what Jim Wallace was saying seems to me to be about voice. And this morning I'm deeply aware that a CTBI group of young men are this very morning leaving Lampedusa, where they've been hearing the stories firsthand of other young men who have made the crossing from North Africa. And they will return and tell their stories. But I wonder who will want to hear their stories. Jim Wallace reminded us, and quoted, that for several decades, progressive politics have been seriously weakened by the loss of any concept of a better society. People have argued for piecemeal improvements. Maybe the churches have been part of that. Have argued for piecemeal improvements in different areas of life, campaigned against new environmental threats or for better treatment of asylum seekers, and have demonstrated against military interventions. Perhaps none so more than this morning is what's needed. But nowhere is there a popular movement capable of inspiring people with a vision of how to make society a substantially better place for the vast majority. Without that vision, politics will rarely provoke more than a yawn. So it makes me think about what might a vision be for us. And I can only speak for myself, and I'd like to offer just 2 minutes of a response to that challenge to bring forward a vision. I long for a Westminster government that is open and welcoming, and doesn't suggest, as a good thing, that a few deaths in the Mediterranean will deter others attempting a crossing. I want a government that accepts children from Calais camps when it says that it will. I want to live in a society where people are not humiliated in job centres and have to go to food banks, where people are honoured for their ability, not pushed down because of their disability. I don't want Empire 2. And somehow the lack of values coming from Westminster pushes me to think rather shockingly, for myself, of independence. But not Scottish nationalism, any more than English nationalism, which is what I believe we're getting now. And the reason I say that is because I think that we can do a lot better than that. I believe we are capable of far more. So part of my vision is that I long for a church that listens to the voices of the dispossessed and cast aside, the separate and the lonely. I long for a church that doesn't judge me, or a refugee, or a Muslim, or worries if I'm gay or straight. I want a church that speaks out for gender justice and dignity for all. I long for a church that seeks unity because it matters more than ever, and because it's what Jesus prayed for, so that the world might believe. I long for a church that doesn't think of itself in terms of an internal market, where difference is accentuated at the expense of common good or common witness. Now, Jim Wallace reminded us that the primary principle of Christian ethics and Christian politics must be respect for every person simply as a person. If each man and woman is a child of God whom God loves and for whom Christ died, then there is in each a worth absolutely independent of all usefulness to society. And again he said, the result of the referendum, therefore, has thrown new light on deeper social, geographic and cultural divides that often lay hidden below the surface of our national conversation. Looking ahead, it seems likely that these stubbornly persistent and growing inequalities will strengthen. So I want to finish with two short quotations from Pope Francis, who spoke these words earlier in the week, and it was in the context of explaining human development. He said this: "It is about integrating different peoples of the earth. The duty of solidarity obliges us to seek just ways of sharing, so that there is not that dramatic inequality between those that have too much and those that have nothing, between those that discard and those that are discarded. Only the way of integration between peoples enables humanity to have a future of peace and hope." In this connection, in fact, the concept of person, born and matured in Christianity, helps us pursue a fully human development, because the word person always means relation, not individualism. It affirms inclusion and not exclusion, the unique and inviolable identity and not exploitation, freedom and not constriction. So, it is about the otherness of God and seeing God in the other, seeing Christ in the other, and recognizing that often and often goes the Christ in the stranger's guise. Thanks.